questions. Questions orales. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to acknowledge that we are on unceded Algonquin territory. My colleague, the Member of Parliament for Abitibi Bay, James Nunavik, EU, presented a bill to fully implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a United Nations document that my colleague actually helped draft. The Prime Minister and all Conservatives voted against it. In light of today's report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is the Prime Minister willing to vote to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I would point out, of course, that Canada is one of the very few countries in the world where Aboriginal and treaty rights are fully recognized in our Constitution. That's one of the reasons why the government accepted the UN Declaration as an aspirational document. We have taken specific actions, Mr. Speaker, to enhance the rights of Aboriginal people, particularly women living on reserves and generally all Aboriginal people under the Canadian Human Rights Act. Sadly, the NDP and the opposition parties voted against it. I hope they will reconsider some of those positions.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Aspirational.
7 years ago, the Prime Minister officially apologized to the survivors of Indian residential schools and to the First Nations. He promised reconciliation. To achieve that, will he finally acknowledge what our laws have said for more than 250 years, that Aboriginal peoples are entitled to a nation-to-nation relationship with the Government of Canada? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the residential school issue and has taken steps to improve the lives of First Nations peoples, and we plan to continue to work with these communities to improve living conditions and the lives of all Aboriginal peoples. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Your intentions are not enough. An apology is only meaningful if it is accompanied by real action. 150,000 children were taken from their homes, taken from their parents in Canada. They were mistreated, horribly abused. As many as 6,000 of them died in Canada. 6,000 children dead in Canada. Does the Prime Minister agree with Justice Sinclair and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the residential school program was nothing short of cultural genocide?
Speaker, I addressed these issues some 7 years ago in the House of Commons, where I spoke about the devastation caused by policy of Indian residential schools, Mr. Speaker. This was a policy of forced assimilation that not only destroyed the lives of individuals, but of entire families and society, and has had long-lasting implications on entire communities in this country. That's, Mr. Speaker, why we've moved forward with the apology and why this government has taken multiple actions over the years to improve the lives of Aboriginal Canadians. We continue to do so. These are concrete steps we are taking. The NDP's voted against every single one of them. I'd encourage them to start to do something positive on this.
A good way to move forward, a good concrete action, would be to recognize that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is right, that this was an attempt at cultural genocide.
150,000 children affected, 6,000 dead. Horrific physical and sexual abuse. And this has affected 7 generations of people. But today, 30% less is going to schooling for Aboriginal children than for other Canadians. Would the Prime Minister find that acceptable for his own children?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this government has taken action on a number of files to improve the lives of Aboriginal peoples.
In the most recent budget, we've put in place new funding for training First Nations for available jobs, new opportunities for economic development through the First Nations land management regime. There is vast amounts of money that are being made available for further progress and reform on First Nations education, including more post-secondary scholarships and opportunities, also some health investments, particularly in mental health, on reserves. These are concrete things. I'd encourage the NDP, rather than opposing them all, actually support some of these things.
Well, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, all Canadian children deserve an equal opportunity in life.
Hear, hear.
This House voted unanimously to close the funding gap for First Nations schools. Why won't the Prime Minister and his government fulfill that promise?
Hear,
Speaker, this government arrived at a historic agreement with the Assembly of First Nations to do just that, to make investments to modernize the education system so that First Nations children would have all the same opportunities, accountabilities, and curriculum of other Canadians. The NDP fought that tooth and nail, Mr. Speaker, but we will continue to move forward with investments and continue to move forward with willing partners, because it is important that First Nations children have those opportunities.
The Honourable Member for Papineau.
Mr. Speaker, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission asks for meaningful actions to address residential schools' legacy of cultural genocide and the ongoing impacts on First Nations, on the Métis Nation, and on Inuit communities. Canada has not yet taken these actions, and so reconciliation remains elusive. Will the Prime Minister match the sincere apology he made 7 years ago with a commitment to real action, nation to nation, on reconciliation?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, it was this government that for the first time in Canadian history recognized the full extent of the damage done by residential schools, not just the destruction of communities and families and the abuse, but also the loss of life in many cases, Mr. Speaker. That's why we issued the historic apology. That's why we signed the settlement, moved forward with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and have moved forward with various initiatives in every single budget, every single year, on a series of things to improve the lives of Aboriginal Canadians. I encourage the Liberal Party to actually support some of those rather than just give us rhetoric.
The Honourable Member for Papineau.
Mr. Speaker, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission clearly stated we can no longer simply talk about reconciliation. It is time to act. The Commission issued 94 recommendations to advance the reconciliation process and restore our relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation. The Liberal Party of Canada accepts and commits today to implementing these 94 recommendations. Will the Prime Minister do the same? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, first of all, the government will examine the recommendations and determine the next steps, Mr. Speaker. We continue to take action and have done so on these issues, including in the most recent budget, on employment, economic development, education, health. But each time, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Party votes against these specific initiatives for Aboriginal Canadians. I would encourage them to change that.
Mr. Speaker, the Commission issued 94 recommendations to advance the process, to close the quality of life gaps that exist, to revitalize Indigenous languages and cultures, and to restore the original respectful relationship with First Nations, Métis Nation, and Inuit peoples. The Liberal Party today accepts and commits to implement these recommendations. Will the Prime Minister stand in this place and do the same?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure there ever was an original relationship that, quite frankly, was as satisfactory as the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party would like to say. What I would say, Mr. Speaker, is obviously the Commission has spent a long time on this report, a commission established by this government. It has issued a large number of recommendations. We are still awaiting the full report. The government will examine all of these, obviously read them, before deciding what the appropriate next steps are.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi Bay James Nunavik EU. Mr. Speaker, today we heard a clear message from survivors and the Commission. Reconciliation is more than words. It also means tangible action. We must also start again on a nation-to-nation basis. In that spirit, I extend my hand to the members opposite, to colleagues opposite, and call on the Prime Minister and ask him if he will be implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we do thank the Commission for their work. As was said, Canada is one of the only countries in the world where Aboriginal and treaty rights are entrenched in our Constitution. We have endorsed the United Nations Declaration as an aspirational document and as a significant step forward in strengthening relations with Aboriginal peoples. We will continue to take concrete measures to improve the living conditions of Aboriginal peoples.
The Honourable Member.
Mr. Speaker, National Chief Bellegarde is pretty clear on this. He says it's hard to talk about reconciliation when you have 120 First Nations communities with boil water advisories. We won't have reconciliation, Mr. Speaker, as long as First Nations live in poverty. And there are kids who don't have schools and safe drinking water. For years, Liberal and Conservative governments have underfunded First Nations compared to other Canadians. Will this government right this injustice and close the funding gap?
Mr. Speaker, our government remains committed to a fair and lasting resolution to the legacy of Indian residential schools. As acknowledged in the Prime Minister's historic apology on behalf of all Canadians in 2008, there is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. Mr. Speaker, we continue to make significant investments in Aboriginal education. Economic Action Plan 2015 committed substantial funding for education on reserve and built upon a $500 million investment announced by the Prime Minister. We will continue to work with First Nations parents, teachers and schools to improve the quality of education on reserve.
The Honourable Member for Churchill.
Mr. Speaker, we heard testimony from survivors today who want the Commission final report to finally be a step towards reconciliation and healing. Concrete recommendations were made, including comments on an inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Will the Prime Minister show leadership and set up a national inquiry and investigation into this matter?
Mr. Speaker, these are terrible crimes against innocent people. The RCMP has in itself said in its own study that the vast majority of these cases are addressed and are solved through police investigations. We don't need yet another study, as I've mentioned before, of the some 40 studies that have already been done. What we need is the police to catch those responsible and ensure that they're punished. What we need now is action. Actions like what our government has taken on matrimonial property rights, the creation of safety plans, or making sure there's shelters available for women on reserves. We're taking action to encourage the opposition to follow our lead.
The Honourable Member for Churchill.
Mr. Speaker, reconciliation, as we heard today, includes a national inquiry into missing and murdered. Let's move to housing. 1/3 of First Nations in Manitoba live in inadequate housing conditions. I've seen them firsthand in our north. Families in overcrowded houses, houses in deep need of repair, homes that are infested by black mold. As National Chief Bellegarde said, how can we expect reconciliation when people live in these conditions? Will the government finally listen to First Nations and act on addressing the deplorable housing conditions in First Nations in the spirit of reconciliation?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government has taken concrete steps to support First Nations in providing safe housing. Since 2006, our government's investments for on-reserve housing have resulted in the construction of close to 12,000 new homes and renovations of nearly 22,000 existing homes in First Nations communities. While we continue to work in collaboration to improve the First Nations quality of life and infrastructure on reserve, The opposition has voted against all of our Aboriginal housing investments, all of our infrastructure investments on reserve, everything that we've done to improve lives of people living on First Nations reserve.
The honourable member from the Nanaimo-Cowichan.
Mr. Speaker, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has called on the government to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Justice Murray Sinclair has described it as, quote, the starting point for reconciliation. But this Conservative government has steadfastly refused to implement the declaration, voting against our bill, and has spent hundreds of millions of dollars fighting Aboriginal rights in courts. Will this government listen to the Commission, and will they finally implement the United Nations Declaration?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As has already been said, Canada is one of the only countries in the world where Aboriginal rights are protected under our Constitution. We have endorsed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as an aspirational document in strengthening the relationship between Aboriginal Canadians and the government, and we will continue to take concrete measures. And we'd ask that the opposition would support our concrete measures to bring things like the same rights for women living on reserve, to bring the same water and wastewater standards that other Canadians expect, and the Canadian Human Rights Act on reserve, Mr. Speaker. All of these things that we have done, they have opposed. They should get on board.
The honourable member for Golden Manitoulin.
For too long, First Nations waited for redress for the injustices they suffered at Canada's residential schools. Students were forced to live in inhumane conditions, and many experienced abuse. Tragically, thousands never returned home. Today, survivors face social, psychological, and health barriers to overcoming the trauma. Yet too many First Nation communities don't have access to quality health care. Will the government finally close the gaps in First Nations health outcomes and guarantee that survivors can access the medical care they require and so desperately need?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, our government is very proud of the relationship that Health Canada has with First Nations, providing over $2.5 billion a year in health care in First Nations. And, Mr. Speaker, in fact, we support $200 million worth of mental health services on reserve, and I'm very proud to see in this latest budget we have a new investment of mental health task crisis teams that can go on to First Nations to support them at crisis times.
The honourable member from
Mr. Speaker, we must put an end to the sad legacy of residential schools. Too many children were victims of heinous abuse. More than 6,000 of them did not survive. Survivors today are still suffering the effects of a stolen childhood. They're facing health problems that also affect their families. They need help and support. That is our moral duty. Will the government take action and adequately fund Aboriginal healing centres?
Again, Mr. Speaker, we are providing mental primary care and, most importantly, I think, mental health services on First Nations to families and children that require it. We have 24/7 access to essential nursing services in almost 80 remote communities across Canada, and we have home and community care in almost 500 First Nations communities across Canada. As I said, Mr. Speaker, we have a very good relationship with First Nations, especially when it comes to our mental health services.
The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. The legacy of the Indian residential school system is more than 150,000 children forced to deny their culture and abandon their language. Thousands of cases of abuse, humiliation, and unspeakable acts. Mothers and fathers who didn't see their children again once they were forcibly taken away. 6,000 children dead, similar to the Second World War. And this intergenerational trauma is still present today. It's our moral duty to take action. Will the government show some leadership and support First Nations?
Mr. Speaker, we certainly thank the residential school survivors for their strength and courage in sharing their story with the Commission and with all Canadians. Our government remains committed to a fair and lasting resolution to the legacy of Indian residential schools. As acknowledged in the Prime Minister's historic apology on behalf of all Canadians in 2008, there is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. Our government will continue to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and take concrete measures to improve the living conditions of Aboriginal people.
Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Speaker, this House apologized to the generation of the residential school survivors, but who will make it right for this generation? We have schools that are crippled by the 2% funding cap, children scooped from their families into a broken child welfare system, a minister that refuses to provide support to fight youth suicide and then blames their parents. Children have only one childhood. It is a resource too precious to be squandered. This government broke its commitment to close the education funding gap. In the spirit of reconciliation, will they address the education crisis today and make it right for this generation of Indigenous children?
Mr. Speaker, I reject much of the premise of that question. Our government remains committed to a fair and lasting resolution to the legacy of Indian residential schools, and as acknowledged in the Prime Minister's historic apology on behalf of all Canadians in 2008, there is no place for the attitudes that led to the Indian residential school system. And, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to make significant investments in Aboriginal education. In the last budget, $200 million more committed to Aboriginal education. The Prime Minister committed $500 million to First Nations schooling infrastructure, and we will continue to work with First Nations parents, teachers, schools, and leaders to improve the quality of education on reserve.
The honourable member for York